Hey guys, welcome to Book Review 140 Part 2. I was just talking in my previous review about how Chiang Kai-Shek had come to power in nationalist China in the late 1920s, essentially through uh, coalition building and then kind of playing enemies off one another. So by the end of the 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek was the undisputed leader of China. Nominally, it was kind of a representative democracy, though really a lot of the people that were quote unquote elected were, if it wasn't direct elections, it was more sort of like will of the people type elections, or um, to the point where the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek in particular um, really had autocratic control of the country. And this would get worse, not better, throughout Chiang Kai-shek's rule as leader until he was eventually overthrown by the communists much later. Um, but speaking of the communists, the one group that did kind of hold out, if very marginally, they were on the ropes, they were on the edges, were the communists. Now, there was kind of a very brief window in the early 1930s when Chiang Kai-shek had defeated all the generals, had done all the mop-up work with a lot of the generals, um, you know, because a lot from the late 1920s to basically like mm, 19 the into the 1930s uh, was a lot, like I said, a lot of mop-up work. But the communists held out, and at first they held out in Jiangxi and Hunan, which are two southern provinces, as well as an area of Hubei, a base there. They created what's known as Soviets, um, kind of, screwing over, some would say bringing righteousness to the unjust, uh, landlords, and essentially enacting early um, communist doctrine in these areas that they controlled directly. But as per my previous review, Chiang Kai-shek had expelled them from the party in 1927, I believe, and was ready to take a number of actions against the communists. Now, the first four actions that he took were partial actions. They were actions that weren't coordinated very well. He was also dealing with the Japanese during this time period. But it was really the fifth anti communist campaign. Let's see if I can find that. Yeah. The fifth anti communist campaign that really was supposed to be the noose around the communists' neck. Chiang Kai-shek built a number of blockhouses around the communist-controlled areas. This essentially being that in warfare, in a classic guerrilla warfare way that you would later see in Vietnam, sort of the guerrillas or the usurpers were not able to hold huge tracts of land against large armies, but kind of in rear areas, in areas that were vulnerable, the guerrillas could attack and win battles that way. So, in order to fortify his position, in order to put his best foot forward in attacking the communists, he built a huge number of blockhouses in a really fairly large area in sort of southwestern Jiangxi and south, no, it was just more or less southern Jiangxi. Um, but there were some corrupt officials during this time period, and this is a very historic or a very important historical event uh, that essentially, in the way that Chiang Kai-shek would often do in his career, wanted to preserve their individual units, their individual troops. Uh, I forget what the general's name was, but he allowed the communists to essentially escape and begin the Long March. Once this was found out, A very large pursuing party was engaged. Initially, Chiang Kai-Shek did not um, personally lead at least in being in close proximity, did not lead the campaign against the communists. But once the outblock was found, he went to Guizhou, he went to Chongqing, which would be very important for him later, uh, to essentially attack the communists directly. It was in, I believe, Zhu Yi, or was it Li Ping? One of those two, that Mao essentially gained power over the ragtag band that he did have. Um, this is when he was elected to the head of the small group that was essentially escaping. I think that they said that the total number of communists in uh, Jiangxi was maybe 2 to 300,000 or something like that. And by the time they got up to Yan'an, I believe, there was maybe like 3,000 left in the group. Now, it's not necessarily that these were all arrested or killed directly by Chiang Kai-shek, but a lot of them just sort of fell off and continued, tried to hide their, communist activities, and folded back into everyday civilian life in southern China. Um, so there were a couple places that were very famous along this way. Guilin, where the nationalists were very close to defeating the communists, and where I believe half the forces were halved from their total during that time period, uh, marching out. Also, a lot of, because like larger supplies and the supply chain goes slower than the forward troops. This was where a lot of communists' supplies were cut off, and the communists would often have to rely upon, after this, local villagers and local Soviets in order to provide them supplies as they made their great retreat in the Long March. So they were initially going to go back north into, I believe, Hubei, the Hubei province, um, and link up with another Soviet there, a large Soviet in Hubei that was actually larger than the Mao uh, influenced or later Mao controlled Soviet in southern Jiangxi, but because of their, it seems strange, but their less successful um, long march, or their retreat themselves up to Shanxi and the Yunnan base, or the Yuan base there. Um, they were not known as the victors in history. I believe it was Ling Bao was their leader. But so the communists decided they needed to retreat further into wilder territory. And if you know anything about the wild territory of China, you know that means the Yunnan province, a province that was nominally under Chinese control, but even at the height of Chiang Kai-shek's power, was pretty much given lip service and run by the local governor, whose name I believe was Yao. They go up to Kunming to get across the Yangtze River. They use some dodging mechanisms, as well as the tributary of the Yangtze, which is around Lutang. There's a very famous bridge there, or yeah. So what happened was there was a ferry town that, you know, um, rivers make very good natural choke points for the nationalist army to confront the communists. And as I mentioned, the communists, the guerrillas, they don't want direct confrontation. They're already retreating. They're already kind of in a bad spot. So they're just looking to survive. Um, so in Lunting, um, there was an advanced communist force. The nationalists marched there, and they expected to. That's where they were going to have the cutoff. but an advanced communist force actually was able to go there, use a ransom to bring the boats from the other side, the local station commander's wife. They captured her, ransomed her to bring boats for this small force. Now, this small force was way ahead of the communists that had been left back. They were an advanced scout force. So they went across the river. By the time that they got a few units across the river, the nationalists had arrived. So they retreated, but you still have the majority of the forces on the south bank. So how are the communists going to get across the Yangtze? Well, they went to, I believe it is Ashun Chang, where there was a rope bridge. Now, we're not talking like a big steel bridge. We're talking like a swaying rope bridge across this tributary of the Yangtze, and essentially use that to get a lot of troops across. I think that this was even in an even more remote area. You got to remember, remote is good for the communists at this time period. It keeps them out of the hairs of the nationalist force. Got across the Great Smoky Mountain, went across this the swamp, which it's not listed on this map here, where they lost numerous other forces. There was also a big argument whether they should go north into Ganju and what eventually wound up being Yan'an, the communist base in the north, or whether they should retreat further inland. So basically the options were, in what Mao ultimately won out on, was there was a larger not larger Soviet, but there was a Soviet-controlled area in the north that had a little larger population, but wasn't really heavily influenced by the nationalists being most powerful in the south, around the Yangtze River, and then also having control of like Beiping or Beijing, Beijing, but not having control of this individual area. Or the alternative was to retreat further into the wilderness, where there was no Soviet setup, but where they'd be even more remotely located. Well, Mao won out. They went north through Gansu and wound up at their base in Yan'an. Now, during this exact same time period, the Japanese were really acting belligerently towards the Chinese nation. They had already been kicked out of the League of Nations for what had happened at Manchuria, Manchukuo, I believe it's called. Let me get to that page. Manchukuo. And so, right when you would think that the nationalists, who still had a much stronger force, would be able to move up and attack and finish off the communists. But they had to deal with the Japanese. They also had to deal with, I told you about that base around Wuhai. They basically pretty much destroyed that base, or Hubei, excuse me, Hubei. They pretty much destroyed that base, and if it wouldn't have been sort of for that diversion of having a split communist force and Chiang Kai-Shaek choosing to take on the larger force, whereas Mao and his smaller force retreated, history might have been different. He might have defeated Mao. Mao might have been killed. I mean, who knows the alternative, histories or circumstances that could have evolved. But between the split army and the fact that the Japanese were coming, that essentially led to them not being able to defeat Mao in Shanxi. Now, there's a very famous incident, Shanxi being the old, its capital, further south in the province, not up north where Yan'an is, where the true Soviet base is, and actually controlled by the nationalists, is the city of Xi'an. And that's where I think it's Xi'an or Xi'an. That's where the Xi'an incident happened. Now, what is the Xi'an incident? Well, there were a lot of commanders. Chiang Kai-Shaek put a lot of emphasis on truly defeating the communists, while the Japanese were acting belligerently, doing military drills around Beiping. The Shanghai incident was happening during this time period, where there were these huge, paramilitary murders that were going on all over the city by Japanese forces. China was just kind of continually, slowly ceding its land and its resources to the Japanese. So there were a lot of commanders under Chiang Kai-Shaek. You got to remember, he is the most powerful figure. He is the ruler of the country, but there's a lot of kind of backbiting. Not directly. They do command him, but not absolute loyalty to him. There was a lot of backbiting that he should be taking on the Japanese. The idea being that the communists and the nationalists were the same people, but the Japanese were a foreign invader. So one of these people was the young marshal, as well as a general. Let's see if I can find what the general's name is. Pretty sure I'm not going to be able to. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to find it. Who decided to kidnap Chiang Kai-Shaek while he was in Xi'an and negotiate a peace, like force a negotiated peace, at least armaments, between the communists and the nationalists while they fought the Japanese. And so essentially, this happened. It's very famous in the course of Chinese history. And this is actually how the book starts. It kind of looks at this at first and then goes to the majority of what happened in history. It's very embarrassing for Chiang Kai-Shaek. Ultimately, the young marshal who had previously controlled Manchuria, now controlled by the Japanese, who had marched his own soldiers south into other parts of northern China, including areas very close to where the communists were at, was arrested by Chiang Kai-Shaek, and even though he wasn't a communist, was later deified by the communists as a hero for the arrest in this incident, and was actually arrested until a very old age, where he was able to move to Hawaii in the territory of the nationalist-controlled territory of Taiwan, even after the communists had taken over control of the rest of China. He was essentially under house arrest the rest of his life. So, this leads us into World War II. Well, what was the turning incident in World War II? Well, the Marco Polo Bridge incident. As I said, the Chinese had taken Manchuria, had taken GI, I believe, or Jihol, and the Chinese really hated it, but to a degree, Manchuria was kind of seen, if important economically, kind of on the edge of the Chinese, influence. So they were not happy with it, but to a degree, it was accepted. But really, sort of the last standing point was in Beijing, or Piping. That's what they called it during that time period. Northern Peace. And it was anything but peaceful. The Japanese had already demanded that, along with Shanghai, that all nationalist troops move out of these two cities, and that it was a Chinese police force, but they weren't the same thing as sort of a nationalist army that could defend the cities. And so the Japanese didn't attack right away, but had a lot of very, brooding, military movements north of the city, and eventually led to the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Now, what happened here? It's crazy how it's crazy how an individual incident, almost down to one person, can lead to the start of a world war. So they were very much on the brink. And what happened was there was one of these military exercises that was going on, I think like 30 or 40 miles west of the city of Beijing. And the Japanese went out, did their shooting exercises. They came back. One of the members was missing. So they sent some people out to go find him, thinking that he was missing, acting belligerently towards the Chinese generals, thinking that they were the ones that kidnapped him in some sort of local, dispute or dislike, for obvious reasons. Um, I think what happened was the Chinese wound up. They I don't think the Japanese killed anybody, or maybe they did. But eventually, what happened is those Japanese soldiers that went out looking for their comrade were killed by the Chinese. The original Japanese guy, who apparently had gotten lost in the woods or something like that, came back. He was fine. He was not arrested by the Japanese. But by this point, Chinese had killed Japanese. At which point, the whole garrison went out and attacked the town. At which point, this was really felt as the last straw in the belligerent movement of Japanese against Chinese. And that is how World War II between China and Japan started. In very quick order, Peking fell. Um, it wasn't much longer until Shanghai fell. Um, the nationalists were at sort of the truth be told, they were way stronger than the communists, and they had a large army. That was the main thing in terms of them versus the communists. But in terms of a modern army, they just had no effect. The Japanese, they could the Chinese could throw huge numbers of soldiers at the Japanese, but the Japanese had large numbers of warplanes. They had tanks. They had machine guns, advanced weaponry, and essentially it was kind of like a knife going through a very large but stick of butter. Um, that happened in Beijing, happened in Shanghai. There was a lot of rioting there. Big Ears Du, who was kind of the head of the Green Gang, used some of his mob connections to engage in a guerrilla warfare against the Chinese there. But really, the worst of the incidents was in Nanjing, now famously known as the Nanjing incident, and where both countries still argue the scope of what happened there. And pretty much, although modern China has had a lot of things wrong with it, they're pretty much right on this case. That the Japanese came in and it was pretty much a free for all. They took over the city fairly easily. I think the battles weren't really the main issue. Really, the thing that was terrible was the way that the Japanese treated the Chinese citizens in the area. We're talking rapes, we're talking indiscriminate shootings, we're talking, huge, just blocks and blocks of city burned down. And it isn't just like the total number, it's also the sadistic quality of it. The Japanese would use Chinese civilians for bayonet practice. They'd throw acid on them. There was a large boat that was, I don't know if it was marked by the Red Cross or not, but was quite clearly a relief effort boat trying to get people across the Yangtze River. Well, the Japanese bombed that, and the majority of the people sunk into the ground. Sunk into the ground, drowned in the river. People were buried alive, all sorts of stuff like that. I'd have to look it up. I don't want to be wrong on this, but I want to say maybe like I should have written this down. The total number killed was, I might take just a wild guess and say maybe like 200,000 or something like that. That might be too high. Because I also forget if it was in the 5 digits or the 6 digits. But whatever it was, it essentially wrecked the city of Nanjing. Chiang Kai-Shaek would engage in a policy of retreat, ironic considering that Mao had just engaged in the Long March. He went essentially up the Nanjing River, reestablishing his capital in Wuhan, Wuhan being seen as the Chicago of a big sort of industrial center, if not quite the financial center, if you will, of the Yangtze region. It took some time, but the Japanese essentially moved up, took that. So really the reason that the Japanese were partially able to take the Yangtze region so easily was because they could move gunboats up the Yangtze. And so they had sort of this long kind of like extended stretch up the Yangtze River. And so Chiang Kai-Shek decided to move his forces further up the Yangtze to Chongqing above the Three Gorges Dam. Very important because up until the building of the Three Gorges Dam, this was an area, except for small boats, that was non-navigable. So it essentially provided a safe haven from the Japanese gunboats. It did not provide a safe haven from Japanese planes that incessantly bombed the city for, I think, like 4 or 5 years or something like that. While his commanders kind of spread more toward the south, but a little bit to the south and the north of this stretch along the Yangtze that the Japanese controlled, and tried to engage in various, if not quite guerrilla movements that were not easily, they didn't necessarily want to engage in like a big direct battle with the Japanese, but they were able to kind of like pincer the Japanese during their time in Wuhan. That being said, those attempts were not very successful, just because the Japanese did have overwhelming military technology and military power, except for total number of people, and essentially continued their campaign. Well, what was the thing that really overturned it? Well, there is some debate whether the Chinese could have overtaken the Japanese by sheer force, by the fact that the Japanese were an occupying force that were, if more military advanced, were definitely extending themselves, and whether the Chinese could have engaged, sort of like the Vietnamese against the United States, engaged in such a long campaign of stalemate that the Japanese would have eventually given up. But the thing that really turned it was the fact that Japan bombed the United States. What this brought in is material on a big, big scale. Let's see here. So, yeah, this brought in material on a big, big scale. It brought in Joseph Stillwater. It brought in Claire Chennault, a man, not a woman, who were at odds. Stillwater was with odds with Chiang Kai-Shek. This partially being because Stillwater was from a very, call them as you see them, not afraid to step on people's feelings mentality of the American military, whereas Chiang Kai-Shek in his coalition building, and also, I mean, I hate to say this as much as it sounds like a stereotype, just the general deferential nature towards authority of Chinese society. And so there were huge conflicts, but ultimately, I think, even though it was a comedy of errors at times, Stillwater and Chennault, Chennault was an airman. He, used his planes essentially to bomb the city.